this video, I'm just going to summarize some of the major issues having to do with epistemic virtues. We'll talk about some of the vices and virtues that are associated with decision-making and critical thinking. There's a very interesting ongoing discussion in a branch of philosophy called epistemology. Epistemology is the part of philosophy that deals with the study of knowledge. Some philosophers who identify themselves as virtue epistemologists, people like prominently Linda Zagzebski, for example, have argued that we should really pay a great deal of attention to what an epistemic virtue is in our decision making and in our thinking, and a lot of the recent attention to the epistemic virtues is due to her work and the work of others too. So let's take a look at what some of the obvious vices are. When we think about vices that impede critical thinking, there are a whole range of them, and they vary from sort of trivial or relatively trivial seeming ones, like, not being careful is a vice. So we'll talk about why we're using language of vice and virtue later on. This does seem like very heavily morally loaded language, but you'll see there's a reason for this. It turns out, as we'll see in a few slides, that there are good moral reasons to be careful about your thinking or to try to avoid the epistemic vices. So carelessness is an obvious one. If you're not careful, then you're going to make mistakes, and you should at least try to be careful. Now, notice that there are two ways to think about these vices. On the one hand, vices like carelessness or closed-mindedness or cowardice, these are vices that, let's just take the first two. So carelessness and closed-mindedness. If we think about carelessness and closed-mindedness, there seems to be a kind of an aspect of this that has to do with psychological limits, or let's say limits on our cognitive capacities. So we can't be always as careful as we'd like to be, just by virtue of the kinds of agents we are and the kinds of brains we have. Sometimes our attention will fail. Similarly with closed-mindedness, we might think we're open-minded, but we can only be so open-minded given the limits of our mental capacity. We have these psychological limits. So when we list these as vices, of course, we're all subject to this, right? We all make careless errors, and we're all, unable to consider as many things as we would hope to be able to consider. We'd only call them vices, though, if we don't make an effort to counteract them. So it's obviously going to be the case that we're stuck with these psychological limits, right? So we have limits on our memory, on our cognitive capacities more generally. We'd only call them morally problematic, I think, if we don't make an effort to counteract them, or if we're, deliberately neglectful of those limits. Okay, so let's look, though, at something like cowardice. This is really hard, right? Because it is tempting to be intellectually cowardly, especially if it turns out that the results of critical thinking or the results of inquiry lead to threatening or undesirable outcomes for our beliefs. So we have some cherished beliefs, and we might be afraid to investigate those cherished beliefs. And cowardice, of course, is going to impede you in being a critical thinker. And this is something that plagues us all. It's not exactly, it's maybe partially the result of psychological limitations, but it falls more generally into let's say the kind of viciousness or vice that we might want to address. We might want to try not to be cowardly in our inquiries and in our thinking and in our decision making. Dogmatism, again, it's sort of driven by fear. So we're somehow unable to or unwilling to consider alternatives. These are sort of obvious cases of impediments to critical thinking. Dishonesty, another obvious case. So if we lie, then clearly that's going to be an impediment. If we habitually lie, obviously all of us lie some of the time, but if we habitually lie, especially in cases where it's important, then it's going to be an impediment. Lack of charity is one we've touched on already in this class. When we think about alternative positions to our own, it's a virtue, certainly, to charitably interpret the position of your opponent. So if someone holds a view at odds with yours, it's an epistemic virtue to interpret their position charitably and give them the best case you can. Laziness is sort of obvious. Again, this is sort of like closed-mindedness or carelessness. It's kind of goes with the territory. We want to be efficient in our thinking, so we are faced with limits. We have limits on our resources. We have limits on our attention, etc. And it's sometimes even efficient to be lazy in these kinds of cases. You want to be as efficient with your resources as possible. And laziness really is the pressure to not expend energy or resources where we can avoid it. So again, laziness is something we're sort of stuck with. That's our natural state. But of course we want to overcome that for the sake of living up to our responsibilities. Self-deception and wishful thinking is extremely problematic for critical thinking. And this is something we'll talk more about later on when we investigate the cognitive biases and heuristics that we employ in our reasoning and decision making. We'll talk about that more going forward. But basically, wishful thinking is a preference for certain preferred beliefs. So we might have a certain set of cherished beliefs, and wishful thinking is the tendency to hope that they're right and to think that they're right by virtue of the fact that we're so attracted to those beliefs, and we sort of start thinking that they sort of have to be true. We'll talk more about that going forward. I realize what I just said is a little garbled, but so superficiality is another vice, and superficiality is really not taking the problem or the issue as seriously as it should be taken, not going as deeply into the question as we should. So enough with the vices. Let's talk about the virtues. So the vices are sort of relatively obvious, although we do need to be reminded of them. The virtues are sort of they're opposites. So be charitable, be open to new ideas, be careful, but be careful when it matters. So it's often going to be the case that these virtues can turn into vices, right? So if we're excessively charitable, that would end up being a vice. So we have to be suitably charitable, suitably open to new ideas. Obviously, if we were completely open to new ideas, then we might risk wasting our resources, wasting our time on ideas that don't merit that kind of resource or attention. So notice that these are kind of ideals, but they're ideals that are going to be tempered also by our other responsibilities and our other limits. So be careful, but be careful when it matters. So a decision, let's say, should I have vanilla or strawberry ice cream, is not really a decision that merits or warrants too much attention or time or resources. Being curious is an important virtue. So when we use the word curious in our time, we mean someone who's, intellectually curious, someone who's looking, who has a genuine interest in learning. Being honest, that's self-explanatory. Intellectual humility is important. So the intellectually virtuous or the epistemically virtuous agent is going to be someone who recognizes that he or she has limits in particular areas, doesn't know everything, and is appropriately epistemically humble when it's warranted. So if you don't know about cars, really, then you should adopt an epistemically humble attitude towards experts. Obviously, that doesn't mean you should blindly trust experts, but it does mean that you shouldn't blindly trust yourself. So someone who doesn't have intellectual humility, who's epistemically arrogant, let's say, would be someone who blindly trusts herself or himself. Being imaginative, we've talked about that a little bit already in this course, but being imaginative is a virtue. It's, as we've seen in terms of arguments, it's going to be very important in the evaluation of arguments to understand epistemic alternatives or to introduce them. And you need to be imaginative in order to do that. So as we've seen, one quick trick for conjuring alternative possibilities is simply to deny some proposition and consider what the denial of that proposition means. So if something, let's say a premise, appears in an argument, it's useful, if we have trouble coming up with alternatives, it's useful to simply deny that premise and see what happens. Objectivity is a difficult one, but basically the idea would be that, an epistemically virtuous agent is one who admits the possibility that his or her way of thinking about things isn't the only way to think about things, that there are some objective criteria that he or she can apply to some decision problem or some epistemic question. Tenacity. Being tenacious just means sticking to things, and it's sort of the opposite of being lazy, right? So it's sort of like the virtue of being hardworking when it comes to epistemic questions. And that's sort of self-explanatory. And being truthful, again, as opposed to being dishonest or etc. That's pretty much straightforward. Of course, it's a difficult philosophical concept, the concept of truth, but for our purposes, being truthful means holding truth to be a value that we aspire to in our reasoning. Okay, so why do we go through this? Why do we list these virtues? Some of them are quite obvious, etc. Well, because it's actually incredibly difficult to be epistemically virtuous or to be intellectually honest, etc. Why is that? Well, look, we have very strong feelings about the things we believe. And speaking for myself, I know that for me, it feels great to think in foggy and mysterious ways. It feels great to consider strange and unlikely ideas, etc. It just feels great. Feels good. I don't know why, but it does. It does for me anyway. And, I feel really important when I can make big, sweeping claims about the nature of reality. I'm in my professional work, part of what I do is metaphysics, and that really satisfies my desire to make big sweeping claims about the nature of reality. So it makes me feel important that I can do that. I certainly don't enjoy being corrected. So when someone points out an error that I make, even though I know I shouldn't resent that, I do. I don't like being corrected when I make a mistake. Maybe that's universal. I mean, it would require incredible epistemic virtue to be able to appreciate being corrected. In some domains, I do appreciate being corrected, but generally speaking, I don't like it. I don't like being wrong. I prefer to think that the world is a simple place than a complex place. I prefer to think that things are manageable and black and white, etc., when I guess I know that they are complex and that things aren't black and white. And look, I would rather things be easy. I'd rather not invest a great deal of time and energy in getting at what's true, and especially if it turns out that investing that energy leads me to recognize that the beliefs that I cherish are false. So why would I want to do that? Well, I want to do it because I want to be epistemically virtuous, but it's hard. It's not easy. And yeah, even though I know better, I certainly think that the people who disagree with me are bad. I know I'm wrong. But I do tend to think, and this is something that I want to correct, that people who don't agree with me, there's something wrong with them. So clearly these are things that I need to get over. And maybe we all need to get over them, but these are the impediments to critical thinking that we face. Okay, so why bother? Why not just go wallow in my ignorance and arrogance and wishful thinking? Why bother? Well, my decision making is the reason why I have some moral obligation to think through the effects of my thinking. So my decision making is going to be influenced by my beliefs. So I have a clear, I think, moral responsibility to make well-informed decisions and rational decisions when the well-being of others depends on the way my decisions turn out. So some course of action might affect the well-being of others. In that case, I don't have the right to be stupid or to be ignorant or to engage in wishful thinking or magical thinking. I have a responsibility when other people's well-being is at stake to try to be as rational and well-informed in my decision-making as possible. Even though it's painful and I don't like it, I still have to do it. So that's why. And, so what I'm going to have to do is learn how to do my best to correct for my biases and my weaknesses as a thinker. And that's enough for today.